Good afternoon. My name is Lauren Leader, CEO of All In Together. Welcome to the Women in Healthcare Equity Forum, where we'll meet and hear from the most luminary women scientists and policymakers leading the fight for health equity. For those of you who don't know us, All In Together is a nonpartisan, nonprofit women's civic education and mobilization organization. Since our founding in 2014, we've trained tens of thousands of women across America to be civic and community leaders, ensuring they have the tools and resources to speak up on behalf of themselves and their communities. This is our fourth Women in Healthcare Forum, but the first one we've done virtually. So we're glad you've joined us today. Today's program has been made possible by companies who've been working tirelessly to help bring not only the COVID vaccines, but many life-saving treatments to the world. We're deeply grateful for the support and partnership of Bristol Myers Squibb, Jansen & Jansen, Merck, Moderna, and Pfizer. We're especially proud that Merck and Jansen & Jansen are also members of the All In Together board. Thank you. Today's program will be powerful and thought-provoking, so I hope you'll stay with us. One note, the full bios and social handles for our speakers are posted on the All In Together website for you to read in full. But we also encourage you to engage with us on Facebook or Twitter to learn more about our amazing speakers and to stay connected with us throughout the program. Our first discussion is with a group of extraordinary women scientists who've been at the forefront of COVID vaccine development and delivery. As much as we've been talking about all things vaccine over these last months, the world still needs to know more about the incredible contributions women have made to this extraordinary scientific breakthrough. Today, we'll hear from three of the women leading the charge, literally, to save the world. Dr. Judy Absalon is Senior Medical Director of Vaccine Clinical Research at Pfizer. She's a first-generation immigrant from Haiti, born and raised in New York City. Dr. Paula Annunziato is Vice President of Global Clinical Development at Merck, specializing in both pediatric and adult vaccines. Jacqueline Miller is Senior Vice President of Infectious Disease Development at Moderna. Prior to this, she was Vice President and Head of Clinical Research and Development. We're thrilled that moderating today's discussion is Apoorva Mandelvili, Science and Global Health reporter for the New York Times. She won the 2019 Victor Cohn Prize for Excellence in Medical Reporting and has been writing about the COVID crisis from the very first days. Please join me in welcoming our first panel.
Thanks, Lauren. Really looking forward to this conversation. There are a lot of things none of us expected with this pandemic, most of them bad, but there has been one wonderful surprise over the past year, and that's how fantastically effective the vaccines are. The FDA was prepared to authorize vaccines that had an efficacy of 50%. So these vaccines that got to 90+% efficacy really overshot that mark. And we also got them really quickly in hand. I believe the fastest we had ever developed a vaccine before this was for mumps, and that took 4 years. So Judy and Jackie, we keep hearing now that things are moving too slowly, the vaccine distribution is going too slowly, but isn't it true that these vaccines were developed astonishingly quickly? Can you talk a bit about how the vaccines were fast, but also safe?
Sure, thank you. I'll start, and then I'm sure Jackie can continue. So I've been asked this question quite a number of times, and I think what I like to explain to people is, first and foremost, we did not skip any steps, right? Vaccine development is typically quite sequential, but given the enormity of the issue, the pandemic, the increasing death rate, and really the fact that the world had come to a stop, we focused all of our energies on this one question and trying to solve this issue. And importantly, a lot of things were done in parallel as opposed to sequentially. I think the other thing that's important to understand is there was worldwide collaboration, particularly between regulators all over the world, but specifically in the United States with the FDA, along with manufacturers. And we essentially increased the pace at which things were submitted and reviewed, and it was an ongoing conversation. And so it allowed us to generate data quickly, but also for FDA to review those data quickly and make decisions about next steps. The other thing from the Pfizer perspective that we took advantage of was looking at different vaccine constructs in the beginning all at the same time, as opposed to one vaccine at a time and determining whether that one worked or not. And that really allowed us to move forward very quickly.
Well, so thank you so much, Judy. And thank you also to the meeting organizers for allowing me to participate. I'm really excited about the conversation today. And I completely agree with everything that Dr. Absalon has just said. And maybe I'll just add that in my experience, this has been a unique collaboration between individuals and academics in public health, in regulatory authorities in terms of giving the guidance that's needed to move programs through the authorization process, and industry, everyone holding hands together and deciding to solve the key problem that's impacting us today. Maybe another point on the safety, because you asked about that specifically. All of the companies have built in independent data safety monitoring reviews. So while things were done largely in parallel, they were gated so that a certain amount of safety data was reviewed, and not by the individual companies, but by these independent safety reviewers, physicians and experts, to make sure that we weren't taking undue risks. And maybe another key point is that the trials have all involved tens of thousands of subjects, including at a minimum 10 to 20,000 subjects who have received the vaccines in question. And now that some of the vaccines are authorized, that marketing, post-marketing safety continues actually into the future. So as millions of people are now being vaccinated, we still continue to review safety in real time. So while we've done things quite quickly and I would say innovatively through collaboration, we've also made sure that we're following the safety as we need to ensure that we're doing the right thing for people.
Well, that's all very reassuring. Paula, the flip side of that, though, is that people also seem to underestimate how difficult it can be to get the vaccines right and to produce them in bulk. We keep hearing about, why is the Defense Production Act not being used to turn every pharma factory into a vaccine manufacturing site? So can you talk a little bit about what some of the challenges in vaccine development are and why we can't just do that, turn every pharma factory into a vaccine site?
Sure. In fact, vaccine manufacturing is highly specialized. Vaccines are typically produced through complex biologic processes, and usually each vaccine has its own unique requirements for specific raw materials, equipment, analytical testing, and all of this is designed to make sure that each lot that's released to the public is in fact with a lot with the highest safety, efficacy, and has been produced with the greatest quality. So to do this at scale requires typically heavy investment in manufacturing processes and facilities, and the entire enterprise is very closely controlled by regulatory agencies. Now, in general, vaccine manufacturing capacity is actually scaled to meet the needs for our existing vaccine ecosystem, and uncovering excess capacity like we need now to meet the needs of COVID vaccines is just extraordinarily challenging. There are, though, certain steps that in manufacturing that are more amenable to be shared across different vaccine processes, different vaccines. And I know that where it is feasible, the companies are speaking to each other, working together to try to find out how we all can assist with manufacturing the COVID vaccines that need to be manufactured at such a huge global scale.
Thank you for that. I want to ask all three of you a question now that seems particularly relevant for this panel, and that is, can you each speak to the role of women in developing these vaccines? My understanding is that there were women involved, in fact, in bringing some of this technology and developing some of this technology to the point where they could be turned into vaccines. Judy, could you begin?
Sure. Thank you for the question. I think, the fact that we're having this discussion today with three women who are vaccines development experts speaks to and the conversation is being led by a woman. It speaks to the importance of women, I think, in science and in the world. There are several people that have been involved across multiple organizations. I think I'll speak to a few, one who I know very well, one who I know a little bit well, and one who I don't know very well at all, but I think were key. So Dr., and I'm going to mispronounce her name a little bit, but Dr. Carrico, who we all know was instrumental in bringing us sort of the mRNA platform through years of work. I think when I've read about her and interacted with her a bit, she's, her efforts speak to perseverance. So not backing down, which I think for many women in science is probably key to all of our careers, both in the past and currently in the future. Dr. Corbett, who's at NIH and has worked on in the lab with others on the spike protein and the conformational changes that actually allowed all of the manufacturers to be able to develop COVID vaccines, many of which are quite successful. And you've talked about both of the mRNA vaccines, which we know work extremely well. And then I would be remiss if I don't talk about the leader in my organization, Catherine Jansen, who I've had the pleasure of working with for over a decade now, and who really rallied her team behind this great effort. And so, my personal opinion is that women have always been key drivers in science. So it's no surprise that we're here to solve this pandemic, but it's nice to see the level of recognition that we're seeing now.
Yes, so I think Judy has already highlighted some of the key women who I think helped all of the vaccines really move forward. Maybe I can speak for a moment about one of the co-primary investigators in our clinical trial, who also, prior to recusing herself for being involved in clinical trials with COVID-19 vaccines, was also the chairman of the Vaccines and Related Biological Products Advisory Committee. So that's Dr. Hana Al-Sali, and she works at the Baylor College of Medicine. We also had many, many female investigators, as did all of the other vaccine companies. And maybe I'll just conclude with saying that I'm hopeful that we get to a point where it's not noteworthy that women were involved in programs, and it's just sort of the expected way in which we solve problems globally. But I've had the real benefit of working with many inspirational women on this project.
Yeah, and so to, carry on the theme, I guess I really want to make sure that I take a minute to thank all the thousands of scientists and researchers, the vaccine developers, essential workers, remote workers, and of course, as Jackie and Judy have mentioned, the clinical trial investigators and the trial volunteers who contributed to the great success of these programs. We owe them all such a great debt of gratitude. And as Jackie and Judy both just mentioned, women have been involved in all of these areas. And you can find women up and down the chain of organizations like those that we are representing today. For example, at Merck, where I work, the head of infectious diseases discovery, who's responsible for the science for vaccines and therapeutics, is a woman, Daria Hazuda, as is her boss, who leads all of Merck research science, Fiona Marshall. And Judy, I do feel that I need to give a shout out to Catherine Jansen as well, because while she was at Merck, she was one of the inventors of Gardasil, which is a vaccine we all know is saving lives as we speak.
That's great. Thank you. Judy and Jackie, what's next for these vaccines? When might we expect to see vaccines for women and for kids? Well, pregnant women, I should mention.
I was going to say, maybe just to emphasize that the vaccines right now are authorized for use in individuals over 18 in the case of Moderna, 16 in the case of Pfizer. So Clinical trials are ongoing in a number of different additional populations. As these vaccines are becoming authorized, studies are continuing into younger age groups, pregnant women, also special populations, including those who might be at increased risk for the severe complications of COVID. And we're continuing to investigate the ways that the vaccines actually are having their impact. So post-authorization safety studies, as I mentioned earlier, in larger sample sizes, and effectiveness studies that really look at the real world effect of implementing these vaccines. So I expect that we will continue to be generating data for these vaccines for some time in the future.
All right, and so just to add, so I completely agree. I think the pediatric population, the younger age groups are one area that we should expect to see additional trials starting. We do have some younger children already in clinical trials for COVID vaccines. And in fact, we've started our pregnancy study last week for COVID. So, you know, in addition to all of the post-marketing data sets that Jackie discussed and trials to be started, it's exciting to at least start to have some, collect some clinical trial data in pregnant women.
Thank you. Paula, I want to ask you about a piece of misinformation, or rather confusion, that seems to be circulating. We hear a lot about vaccines preventing sickness and death, but there seems to be a lot of confusion on whether and how much the vaccines also prevent infection and transmission of the virus from an immunized person. Can you address that?
Yeah, you know, these are very important questions, and there are studies that are going on now in immunized people to try to answer exactly the question you just posed. In fact, there was a recent report out of the United Kingdom where investigators shared some very encouraging results that healthcare workers who had been vaccinated had a lower risk of SARS-CoV-2 infection following vaccination. Now, at this point, these results are really still too limited. The duration of the study is too short to really make any conclusions. And so for people who have been immunized so far, we still do need to recommend that they wear masks and practice social distancing. But hopefully over time, the answer to the question you posed will be more conclusively answered.
Thank you. Judy, another piece of misinformation that is actually particularly vile, that vaccines cause infertility in women. How do we work to combat those rumors and to reduce vaccine hesitancy?
So I think the important point is a little bit of what I mentioned in the previous discussion. So we have started trials in pregnant women. So that's, you know, obviously they're already pregnant, so they, you know, it doesn't directly answer the question. But one of the things that is pretty standard for manufacturers prior to conducting maternal immunization trials is that we do reproductive toxicity studies in animals as a prerequisite, and that, you know, those studies have been conducted and show pretty definitively that there's no evidence of infertility toxicity in animals, but those data are widely accepted prior to going into clinical trials. So I think, you know, from my perspective, there's no data to support these rumors, and, you know, in terms of solving for it, it's really doing what we're doing now, which is creating opportunities to discuss these questions, answering, you know, speaking to some of the mistruths, and hoping that the community listens and believes us.
And Jackie, I have a question for you about the variants of the virus. This seems to be the big wild card, and we keep hearing about how they could really change the picture. Can you talk briefly about what we know of the variants so far and whether they are likely to affect the vaccine's effectiveness?
Yes, so great and timely question. So the first thing I want to say about variants is that knowing what we know about viruses in general, the fact that some variants have emerged is not entirely unexpected. So think about the flu vaccine that we're all recommended to get every year. The reason why you get an annual booster for flu is because the influenza virus is constantly evolving and mutating and drifting from its initial sequence. So SARS-CoV-2 has now infected millions of humans. And with all of that infection, the virus starts to learn how to become a more effective infector of the species which it now targets. So I think we've always known that viruses can mutate and emerge over time. What we're seeing now, and pretty consistently across all of the vaccines, is that while there is some reduction in neutralization, overall, for the most part, there is still some effectiveness that can be obtained from the vaccines. And actually, many of them have quite good efficacy in regions where these variants are more frequent. Going forward, though, just like with flu, we'll need to learn how to adapt to the changing virus. And that's definitely part of the next steps of investigating vaccines with SARS-CoV-2.
Thank you. We're actually almost out of time. We just have a couple of minutes left. So I'd like to ask each of you if you have one parting thought for our audience, if you wanted them to take away one thing from this panel discussion about the vaccines, what would that be? Judy, could we begin with you?
I think what I'd like people to understand, and I think this was spoken to at the beginning, is that, you know, the solutions that we've come to with these very effective COVID vaccines have required the collective effort of everyone who could contribute to this and knew anything about this process. And, you know, literally the world came together to come up with a solution. And I think the data not only demonstrate that these vaccines have high efficacy, but that they're safe. And so I guess I would say to people that they should have faith that all of the scientists and the regulators and, you know, everyone else around the world who contributed to this really believe that it's a good thing. And, you know, I guess I'd ask them for trust that we collectively came together for a solution, and it looks like a good solution. So
we have just about a minute left. So Jackie and Paula, any last thoughts?
I guess what I will say is hopefully what you take away from this conversation is that women really do have opportunities, particularly in science, to make a contribution. So if you have an interest, I think there's no time like now with the pandemic facing us to lean in and really participate and get involved. So hopefully we've demonstrated to you that women have played a really important role in the development of these products.
Thank you so much, all of you, for your wonderful answers. I certainly learned a lot, and I'm sure our audience did too. Thank you very much.
Thank you all so much for that great discussion. It's an exciting time for science and amazing to hear from such an extraordinary group of women. As a reminder, the full bios for all our speakers are posted on the AIT website, and be sure to follow us on Facebook and Twitter to learn more. As vaccines roll out across America and around the world, issues of equity and access have been front and center. A critical dimension that's often overlooked in the media is the importance of diversity in clinical trials. This topic has been central to the development and approval of the COVID vaccines in ways that set a standard for R&D into the future. Today, we have a chance to hear from two of the most respected authorities on this important topic. Stacey Hargraves is Vice President of R&D Portfolio Management at Jansen and is the author and executive sponsor of Johnson & Johnson's Diversity and Inclusion in Clinical Trials strategy. Dr. Monica Webb-Hooper is Deputy Director of the National Institute on Minority Health and Health Disparities at the National Institutes of Health. Moderating the discussion is Shefali Luthra, healthcare reporter for the 19th News. Since July 2020, Shefali's been covering the intersection of gender and healthcare. Please join me in welcoming them.
Lauren, thank you so much for that introduction. I am so excited to have this conversation. As Lauren mentioned, I'm Shefali Luthra from the 19th, and I will be speaking with Stacey Hargraves and Dr. Monica Webb-Hooper from Johnson & Johnson and the NIH respectively. I think this is going to be a really great and important conversation about clinical trial diversity. And I wanted to start the two of you with just kind of a broad overview. I mean, we talk about this a lot, and when you hear the phrase clinical trial diversity, what does that mean to you, and how should we think about this? Is this race? Is it sex and gender? Is it pregnancy status or certain health conditions? And why is it such an important thing for us to emphasize?
Traditionally, when I think about it in a clinical trial environment, diversity was, mentioned, measured according to race and ethnicity. And Black, African American, Hispanic, Latinx, Pacific Islander, Asian, Native American. But most recently, I've been encouraging, folks in the clinical trial teams and the clinical trial field to broaden that definition. We know that diversity includes race and ethnicity, it's gender, it's age, it's LGBTQ, it's women of childbearing potential, it's including, people with comorbidities. Depending on the product and the intended patient population, which we're, really trying to serve, that definition of diversity should be broad. And should have a lens that we could apply and change and morph depending on what we're trying to achieve in the trial. So to answer your question, from my perspective, it's all of the above.
I agree with what Stacey indicated. I think, by definition, diversity means variety. I think too frequently, the word diversity or diverse populations, diverse communities is being used as a proxy or interchangeably with race or ethnicity. But in fact, diversity means everyone. So when we say we want diversity in a clinical trial, we mean we want everyone to participate in the trial. And that also, when you think about the dimensions, in addition to those that Stacey mentioned, I would also add geographic location, mental health, religion, cognitive, sensory, or physical disability, and other characteristics that add to a diverse group. When you think about clinical trials, the other thing I think about is that it's important to have diversity in the representation among participants, particularly in cases where you want to ensure that the patient sample or the participants match the burden, the representation matches the burden in the actual in the general population for where you might find the specific condition. But diversity means variety. It doesn't mean race or ethnicity specifically.
And that actually segues, I think, really wonderfully into the next thing I wanted to ask both of you, which is, how has something like the pandemic, right, the past year, which has had a really disproportionate impact, right, on folks of certain communities and certain ethnicities, specifically Black and Latinx people, has this helped us understand why clinical trial diversity matters, and if so, how?
So I would say kind of, at this unprecedented time in history, and racial health equity has suddenly kind of jumped to the forefront, right, of the conversation. It's eliminated the need for diversity and inclusion in trials. But for those of us who have been, have made clinical research our career, this topic is not new. I think that the pandemic highlighted many of the things we knew and we aim to address, like access, awareness, trust, across our portfolio of trials. And the lack of diversity in clinical development process interferes with the goals in science and medicine, and therefore it denies us the opportunity to understand the difference in safety and efficacy across the population. So therefore, from my perspective, I think it's just, we knew a lot, right? We knew the things that affected these populations. I think the pandemic has just exacerbated what we know, but therefore everyone's talking about it. So now we can really address and do something about it.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, COVID-19, for many people, this is the first time that many people have sort of watched the new wave of health disparities unfold in real time. And the health disparities that have existed are really longstanding. And I agree with Stacey that this lack of inclusion is not a new issue, but you've not seen, at least I've not seen so many media stories on this issue. So COVID-19 does create this kind of long needed window of opportunity to focus on improving the overall lack of diversity and inclusion in trials. And this is important because of, I think, the implementation, the public confidence. One point I'd like to make is that the representation is not important because of potential inherent genetic or biological differences based on race, right? Race is a social construct. Human bodies are human bodies. They function the same way, irrespective of phenotypic traits, such as one's skin tone. But it's important because we do want the representation to match the burden, and we do want to assist with public confidence that this can work for me and for people in my community. But that's an important thing I think we need to make sure everyone's, pretty clear on.
So, I mean, building off of that, is there a relationship between ensuring that we have representative clinical trials, communicating that happened to the general public, and then bolstering vaccine confidence? And we know, right, that vaccine confidence has been really important. I was recently reading a story about LGBTQ plus folks and people who are HIV positive, right, wondering, was this made for me in mind? Is this a path forward to helping people feel like they can safely take this vaccine?
I think in this case, yes. In this case, being able to, because of the attention around this topic, it is important to be able to answer questions for people about whether or not there were people who identify with the various social categories that we identify with in the trial. I think we need to make sure that we are educating them about why that's important. You wouldn't expect, for instance, that on the basis of one's sexual orientation or gender identity, that a vaccine would work any different. But if you have an underlying medical condition, such as you're a person living with HIV, then that's a reasonable, I think, question to want to understand because of the vulnerability, the medical vulnerability that one may have. So I think it is important in this case. What I find interesting also is that the transparency around COVID-19 treatment and vaccines and the discussion has activated these conversations where in the past, you go in, you visit your doctor, they tell you you're due for this shot, you get the shot, you go. You never ask, what company developed this vaccine and who was in the trial? Or, when you take a pill, we don't think about those questions, and it's okay. We can be asking those questions, but I wouldn't want that concern to prevent people from accepting this vaccine if they were to find out that, a particular trial company did not assess sexual and gender identity, for instance, as a criteria for eligibility in the study or gather that type of information. That makes sense.
It does. So I guess, thinking through that a bit more, are there other things to communicate that might be equally meaningful beyond just sort of who was this tested on, that can help people sort of feel that same level of confidence?
I can go there as well. I think, so the NIH, so one of the initiatives that the National Institutes of Health has is called SEAL, and it's CEAL, it's Community Engagement Alliance Against COVID-19 Disparities. And the reason that SEAL was stood up was to help deliver sort of education, outreach, awareness about first just what clinical trials are. And starting from that point for those who might need that background. And then to talk about the protections that are in place for research participants who are doing this on a voluntary basis. And then also to provide education about concerns that have been expressed, such as, the speed of development of the vaccine and where corners being cut. There's so much misinformation around this vaccine that there's been, or around COVID-19 vaccine, the various platforms that will hopefully be available to us, that we need to just make sure that we are delivering accurate and consistent messages. And we also need, I think, to provide some grace, understanding that the messages and the information changes, right? As more is learned, this is a novel virus and a novel disease manifestation. And so there is real-time data. Every day there are new studies coming out, and we need to sort of take those, look at the source of those studies, and make sure that we're getting them from reputable sources, because I think the disinformation is that deliberate spread of false information. And that is really helping to create concerns among populations who may have experienced negative health experiences directly or vicariously that we need to think about and address in this case. But the SEAL initiative it's engaged research teams across the country who have deep relationships within communities, and they are on the ground helping to educate, provide information, and answer questions that are on the minds of many people about the safety and other concerns that have been raised about coronavirus vaccines.
I do also want to sort of think big picture, right? We've talked, right, the three of us, I know you two, you spend your whole careers thinking about why it's so important to have inclusive, diverse clinical trials. On the flip side, almost, how do we get there without being coercive, right? And there's a long history of medical experimentation on underrepresented folks. What does it look like to create a pharmaceutical research culture that is inclusive but not coercive?
Yeah, I was a bit, as you were talking, I was thinking about this a bit, and I don't really think it's about coercion. I think that I found that when you're interacting with communities of color, diverse participants, and you're wanting them to volunteer for clinical trials, they tend to do so when they are informed, right? So as an industry, we do things like provide, informed consents in languages, multiple languages. We provide access to clinical trial educators, as Dr. Hooper talked about, to just talk to them, sit down, like in the clinic, in the doctor's office, about what it means to participate in the clinical trial and take the time to talk them through and educate them through the clinical trial process. We talk to them about what to expect, like what does the follow-up look like after they've participated or after they've been dosed. We provide them with, multicultural brochures. We know that representation matters. You want to give them things that that with people who look and reflect them as they're participating and wanting to ask questions about the clinical trial. And I think if you do all these things, right, and you think about these in the beginning, right, way from the beginning when you're starting to design the clinical trial, people raise their hand. So I don't think it's ever about, from my perspective, never about really coercion, or it's really about how do you educate people so they're ready and wanting to volunteer.
I just wanted to add to that. I think that's spot on. And I'll also say that, I think there is a myth that racial and ethnic minority populations are not willing to participate in clinical trials. And we have several well-conducted studies to demonstrate that there's no difference in willing to participate in the trial. In many cases, no one's asked them to participate. It's been exclusion versus necessarily saying that someone is not interested. So I think it's important that we dismiss that notion that racial and ethnic minority groups are just not interested or are hard to reach. Definitely one of my least favorite phrases. Instead, I think we just need to modify our approaches. I think hard to reach is inaccurate. I think it's unfair. Perhaps we just haven't identified the best approaches to reach certain communities, or we haven't done enough to ease the minds of various populations around research, or even just ask them to participate and explain why it would be beneficial.
How much of this, everything you're talking about, I mean, it's almost speaking to, right, what mindset you bring when you begin to formulate a study. How much of inclusivity then starts with the folks who are in the room early on, designing experiments, developing drugs, funding those?
I think that's a great question, Shefali. I mean, exactly what I was thinking that when Dr. Hooper was talking about is to get to more inclusive trials, right? And the journey to get here to date, I think is directly attributed to the how, right? And to design inclusive trials, you need to have people around the table who are comfortable talking about diversity. And you have to have people, physicians, clinical trial coordinators, clinical trial researchers, team of people who enable the clinical trial to actually be written and executed, is to really have them be comfortable with the notion of talking about diversity and diverse participants and what does that look like and challenging the status quo. That gets to an inclusive environment internally when you think about some of the pharma companies and biotech companies. But if you don't have that culture and you're willing to have those conversations, that may make people uncomfortable, or you didn't really, educate them around, the definition of diversity or how to have inclusive conversations, it gets tough, right, to design those kind of trials. We're making progress. I think you see across the industry now, everybody's talking about diversity in clinical trial. But we got to get really focused on the how. What does it mean? It means really writing protocols that are inclusive, looking at patients from a diverse participant, and then getting down to the actual execution at a trial level. What does that mean? How are we being inclusive with the sites that we select? Are we making sure that we're including like Dr. Hooper said, geographical, locations that where diversity could be achieved. A lot of this is against the status quo and things we all used to have been doing and executing clinical trials, but I see the progress and I think we're going to get there.
Thinking about that sort of longer term, right? Thinking about the shift that you're describing, and that I think arguably, right, began a couple decades ago when we first saw a push from Congress, right, to even make sure we included women in trials. Why has it taken us so long to get to this point where we're having this conversation on a level larger than the fields that you two work in every day? And what are the barriers that exist on a systemic level when it comes to crafting inclusive trials?
I'll start there. I'll start on this one. I think, your bigger question of why now and why are people discussing this now? I think that 2020 is the reason why. I think that what happened in 2020, that collision with this pandemic and the longstanding pandemic of racial injustice in this country has led us to where we are now. It is those are the reasons that this was the light is shining so bright on these topics, and I think it's important. I think it's far overdue. I'm at the National Institute on Minority Health and Health Disparities, so this is what we do. But to have other people talking about it means that there are opportunities for change and for things to change for the better. So I think it's really positive. Of course, it's unfortunate what it took for us to get to this point and to be open to having these conversations. But nevertheless, we're here. I see us as having a window of opportunity that we want to make sure that we leverage in the most positive way. I think I agree that from the beginning, engaging communities that we'd like to see participate in these trials who may be underrepresented is important. At the decision-making table needs to be representatives from various communities who represent diversity in the broadest sense of the word. So you want to have women at the table. You don't want to have, research teams that are just male, for instance. We want to have diverse voices at the table. So because everyone's bringing a different perspective based on their lived experience and their professional experience, we need to, in the field, think about the field of science and medicine. We need to create pathways to success in the STEM fields, so that we can increase our representation of women, racial ethnic minorities, sexual gender minorities at the decision-making table. If we start there, and those are structural barriers that need to change in order for that to happen. But if we start there, that would be, I think, really positive for how we can craft more potentially diverse trials from the very beginning. The other piece of that is I think research teams really should think about social determinants of health from the beginning. So the things that will influence one's ability to participate, it's not just about individual choice and solutions. There are systems level variables that can be modified to make it more, make trial participation more amenable to people. So just one quick example, if you want to make sure that your trial is balanced in terms of sex and gender, you may want to, think about making sure that, things that might be traditionally more of a female's or a woman's responsibility might be childcare. So you want to make sure that you have, that social determinant to be addressed to make sure that, we can have, more people participating in the trial. So there's many different ways you can think about this. And that I think is why having those diverse voices at the table would be important.
And listen, we are running low on time. And so I want to throw one more question into the mix, which you two can feel free to answer, or we can keep going with the previous question, because I know you had things to say, Stacey, which is I do want to ask if there are things that the federal government could do to incentivize more inclusive drug development. Is there a role for public policy? And if so, what would that look like? And would that be an effective avenue toward meeting some of the goals that we're talking about?
Well, I'm speaking from a government perspective, but specifically an NIH perspective. So we don't set policy. We are charged with generating data and evidence that can inform policy. But on the other side of that, I know that policy interventions can be very effective in multiple ways. And it would be a matter of monitoring the policy over time to look at, have there been significant changes pre-implementation of the policy to post-implementation and over time. That's where you understand if the policy was effective or if there need to be changes or ways that you can augment the policy in whatever the question happens to be.
And I would just add that, I think if you kind of look from an industry perspective, policy changes and implementation could help, the right ones, to help drive this conversation around, inclusive and diverse trials. And I've seen a gamut of what that might look like. Is that, specifically a number related to, specific trial and what that should be around particular patients or participants? Or how do we, incentivize, right, really to making sure that we have diverse trials across the industry? I think it depends. And I think it would be a hotly contested debate about what that actual policy could look like. But I think now's the time, right, to have these kind of conversations and what moves the needle. I was just going to say, Shefali, I always get a question from people of what does success look like in this space? Those of us who've been in it for a while, and have really been working hard, like Dr. Hooper and I, to kind of make a difference. For me, it's, if we're sitting here years from now still having this conversation, then obviously it's not success. If we're sitting here, we're no longer having to talk about the risk clinical trials because they have evolved to be inclusive, completely inclusive, to where we're not having to segment out a conversation around diversity. I think that's the win for me. That means that our teams are fully integrated. They're fully, willing to have the conversation about the diversity. They're really wanting to challenge each other around that definition of diversity, particular to the trial. That, to me, is when I call this a win, and that we're really being able to move the needle and say that we have done the hard work to change how we look at clinical trials.
This has been wonderful, and I think that's a great note to end on. So thank you both so much. I really enjoyed this, and I learned a lot.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much. Now for our final keynote conversation. If we've learned one thing from this pandemic, it's that policy matters. The investments and decisions made by the federal government in terms of healthcare equity and access has huge and wide-ranging implications for every American. To help us understand the past, present, and future of inclusive healthcare policy, we're going to hear from an extraordinary group of women who've been thinking about and working on these issues their whole careers. We are thrilled to have Kathleen Sebelius, CEO of Sebelius Resources, who served in President Barack Obama's cabinet as the 21st Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services. Before assuming this hugely important role, she was governor of Kansas from 2003 to 2009. Joining Secretary Sebelius is Congresswoman Lauren Underwood, who's been serving Illinois' 14th congressional district since 2019. She's the youngest African-American woman to serve in the U.S. House of Representatives, and she co-founded and co-chairs the Black Maternal Health Caucus. Last but not least, we are so pleased to have Dr. Frida Lewis Hall, former Chief Medical Officer and Executive Vice President at Pfizer, to lead our conversation. She's been in the healthcare industry for 35 years and was appointed by the Obama administration to the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Frida Lewis Hall, Secretary Kathleen Sebelius, and Congresswoman Lauren Underwood. Frida, over to you.
Thank you, Lauren, and welcome Representative Underwood and Secretary Sebelius. COVID has been quite a storm. It has exposed or re-exposed the magnitude of U.S. health inequities. These inequities, in particular in African American, Latinx, and Indigenous communities, have been seen in COVID infection, hospitalization, and in mortality rates. And beyond that, we're reminded of stark differences in prevalence and outcomes in a range of other illnesses, in chronic and acute, in rare and common, from cradle to grave. So we've seen this in infant mortality and maternal mortality, in diabetes and sarcoidosis, and we've also seen it in a range of cancers, and on and on and on. Many of these inequities have structural causes and warrant policy level solutions. Many believe that this is an opportunity for us to elucidate barriers and to devise solutions that address such issues as economic disparities, consumer and patient empowerment, social determinants, delivery system obstacles, cost and access care, and of course, much more. So first question, with so much to be addressed, what do you think are the health equity issues to be addressed most urgently? And Representative Underwood, why don't we start with you?
Well, thank you so much. I know, as you mentioned in your opening, that the COVID-19 pandemic has just devastated every community across this country. But we know that there are people who face even higher levels of risk, whether it's because of their age or their living arrangements or their job or an underlying health condition. We've also seen unique risks for pregnant people. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention has found that pregnant people with COVID-19 are at an increased risk for severe illness from the coronavirus, and they might be at an increased risk for adverse birth outcomes as well. And so for women of color, the CDC found that these dangers are even greater. Hispanic pregnant people have experienced disproportionate rates of infection and deaths, and Black women are also dying from COVID-19 at substantially higher rates. And so, we've seen that we have a maternal health crisis that predated this pandemic, right? So in our country, maternal mortality rates have increased in the United States throughout my lifetime. I'm 34, even as they've fallen around the world. And now we have the highest pregnancy-related mortality rate of any developed country. For Black women, this situation is particularly more dire. The maternal mortality rate for Black moms is 3 to 4 times higher than the rate for white moms. And we see elevated mortality and morbidity for other women and birthing people of color as well. So, like so many other issues, right, COVID-19 is both revealing and exacerbating longstanding health disparities. And just as we need to center equity in our response to the pandemic, we also need to take bold action to directly target the drivers of maternal health disparities. The causes of this crisis are multifaceted. There's clinical and non-clinical issues that are involved, and we need to ensure that every pregnant person receives safe, respectful, culturally appropriate maternity care, but also they need to have housing and transportation and nutrition and other social determinants of health accounted for. And so all of those issues have also been worsened by this pandemic. Higher food insecurity related to job losses, and then we've seen people lose their health insurance coverage, right? And so there's an urgent need for a variety of policies to support pregnant people and new moms during this pandemic and beyond. And I look forward to discussing some of those solutions today.
Fabulous. Thank you so much. And Secretary Sebelius.
Well, I would start by echoing what Congresswoman Underwood said. She's become one of the leading national experts on maternal mortality issues, and we are so lucky to have her voice in Congress right now driving this important issue and waving a flag about the fact that we have a national health crisis. We are losing mothers and often their babies to what should be the most joyous experience in any woman's life. So let's just start there. I think that there's no question that we learned a couple of really important things in COVID. One of them is we don't have to preach anymore that the economy is intimately tied to our health, and we cannot be a prosperous, resilient nation unless we are a healthy nation, and we are far from being a healthy nation. Women are at the forefront of not only the health workforce, but they're at the forefront of making family decisions about healthcare. They're at the forefront of longer lives and taking care of their families. So they need to be at the forefront of this recovery. And I think if we know nothing else, we know that our public health offices across this country have been decimated in the right after the downturn of the economy in 08 and 09, never rebuilt, and then further decimated by the partisan attacks about science and the health leaders going forward. So this is potentially a post 9/11 moment where we have an opportunity with some dedication to rebuild that infrastructure the same way we determined that when attacked by a foreign nation and foreign adversaries. We would never let that happen again after 9/11. We should never let a pandemic happen again that devastates our country. But it starts from the bottom up, and it really starts not just from local health departments, but I think it starts from a level of neighborhoods. Investing in social determinants on health is the only way we build resiliency across this country, that we deal with health disparities, and we make sure that people are actually able to live longer, more productive lives in the future.
So we've really come at this from two directions. One that says we'll focus on an equity issue and apply the structural solutions. And then the other is, in general, there's structural solutions that need to be applied across the board. So Secretary Sebelius, let's talk a little bit about, what then might be some of the solutions on the structural side.
Well, I think, again, investment of funds and a workforce is critical. And it really starts at the neighborhood level. In some ways, I know Congresswoman Underwood will talk about this, but we're talking about solving some of the same situational problems. Is you can't do it from on high. You can't do it looking at numbers. You have to get to neighborhoods. This is about investing in neighborhoods. And unfortunately, we have a grim roadmap from COVID. We know the neighborhoods that were most devastated, most likely to include individuals suffering from not just COVID-related illness, but started with pre-existing conditions, started with unsafe living conditions, I'm tired of using food insecurity, they're starving. People are not eating enough. Food insecurity is too polite a term, but those are the neighborhoods that need enormous and immediate help and revenue, as well as a workforce that begins to work on the ground in those neighborhoods, reaching out to folks, intervening earlier, building a system. Some of it is about health insurance. Some of it is about connecting to their local community health center. Some of it is making sure vaccination rates go up, and we're doing a better job monitoring and dealing and hopefully preventive chronic diseases. It's about food, it's about water, but following the COVID roadmap throughout this country, putting resources immediately and urgently in those neighborhoods first, and then building, again, a system that works, I think is a step in the right direction.
And Representative Underwood, if we kind of turn our perspective and focus to maternal mortality, what do you think some of the solutions are?
Well, Secretary Sebelius is right. If we make these key investments to improve our public health workforce, we will make some important inroads towards ending our nation's maternal mortality crisis. But there's more that we have to do. And so last month, I reintroduced the Black Maternal Health Momnibus Act with Senator Cory Booker, and now more than 100 House co-sponsors. The Momnibus is a piece of legislation that I first introduced last year with then Senator, now Vice President Kamala Harris. And it's a suite of 12 bills that include bipartisan policies to save moms' lives and racial and ethnic disparities in maternal health outcomes, and promote true equity and justice for all. These policies build on existing legislation to comprehensively address every driver of the maternal health crisis in the United States, including both clinical and non-clinical issues that I mentioned earlier. For example, the Momnibus includes policies to provide training on bias and racism to maternity care providers, ensuring that clinical care is consistently respectful and culturally appropriate for every pregnant person and new mom. But the legislation also includes funding to ensure that every mom has access to robust social services that they need and deserve throughout the pregnancy and the full year-long postpartum period and beyond. So one of the most important social determinants of health is nutrition. And there's robust evidence showing that the WIC program, which provides nutrition support for women, infants, and children, improves health outcomes for moms and babies, and it even reduces mortality. But many families that need WIC the most, they don't have access to those benefits. And so the Momnibus extends WIC eligibility in the postpartum and breastfeeding periods, ensuring that new moms and their children can get the nutrition support that they depend on. Other policies in the Momnibus improve data collection, they support women veterans, they grow and diversify the perinatal workforce, and address maternal mental health conditions and substance use disorders. I'm committed to passing the legislation so that we can safeguard maternal health during COVID-19 and end our maternal mortality and maternal health disparities permanently.
So we've talked a lot about both barriers and solutions, and with COVID being what it has been, everyone's looking for a silver lining. Or as my mother my mother had a different version of every cloud has a silver lining. She would always say, don't allow the storm to disrupt your journey, allow it to clear your path. So what do you think are the silver linings or clear paths that we found in our COVID experience?
Oh, well, thank you. What I've really seen is that people who might not have been aware of the stark health disparities in our country, they're really coming to understand the depth of the problem. Throughout 2020, we had this interesting confluence of events, right? We've seen our communities confront systemic racism and work to advance equity in response to both the pandemic and the deaths of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, right? And so this became this real movement to do this anti-racism work to end these disparities, and people are really coming to understand the need to make sustained investments in improving infrastructure like public health infrastructure, right? If we're going to have a systems level problem, we have to have systems level solutions. And one of them, like Secretary Sebelius described, is making these key investments. Our state and local health departments have just been chronically underfunded for years, and they play such important roles in our communities. And now people understand, right? They understand that they have a health department. They understand what that health department does, and they even recognize the leader of their health department. It's someone that they feel like they know intimately because they're counting on that person to succeed in order to allow their communities to be successful. And so we need to make these robust investments to improve our public health infrastructure, not just during this pandemic, but after the pandemic, so that health departments can carry forward their critical initiatives to keep our communities safe and healthy, and so that we're better prepared for the next public health emergency down the line.
And Secretary Sebelius.
Well, again, I want to echo my colleague's notion that, public health is all of our health. It used to be sort of a sideline. What we know now, it's about our economy, about our prosperity, and it's about all of us. So that's a good place to start. That has been peeled back. I want to also just mention, since this is a woman forward program, I think there are some breakthroughs in the COVID era that could be potentially very, very helpful to women. So some of the telework issues, if we can get children safely back in school and back out of the house, teleworking could be incredibly helpful and beneficial to a lot of working moms who are still trying to juggle school schedules and being a good worker. What employers now know is workers can be very productive at home, that it's not slacking off or slouching off. We got to make sure that the telework opportunities apply across the board, though, and apply to a lot of working parents who really need them. I think the other thing is the commitment, which we've talked about forever, about finally getting broadband extended to all neighborhoods, all areas, is an urgent need, and it will help the disparity that we see right now in kids trying to be virtually schooled and can't get an internet connection. It also affects those health departments and records. You can't transfer information. So that could be a real step forward. And third, telehealth in many areas, and particularly in areas like mental health and children's specialty areas, could be an enormous advantage to reducing the disparity, expanding access of everyone. So there are some features that became essential when people were told to stay home that will be really important moving forward. And I would say having President Biden in place at this particular moment, with a dedication to deal with some of these very structural issues, structural problems that have been there for a very long time, but understanding that women have taken the brunt of this COVID disaster, that Black and brown women have taken the super brunt because they were already at economic disadvantage, they already had jobs that were often without health insurance, that they are in the front lines, and that making sure that whatever policy we deal with and whatever policy is put forward sees the world through that lens, that is the urgent need. Those are the care workers that we need to take care of first. And then we build a more resilient and prosperous country from the ground up.
So we've shared a lot today. There's certainly a lot to do. I want to thank both of you for sharing your time, for your insights, for your commitment, and for your service. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you all for joining us for this remarkable set of conversations. I have learned so much from each of the incredible leaders we've heard from today, and I hope you did too. Thank you once again to all of our sponsors, Bristol Myers Squibb, Johnson & Johnson, Merck, Moderna, and Pfizer for making this program possible. Throughout 2021, AIT will be offering extraordinary programs like this one with many more amazing women. Be sure to register for our upcoming Black Women Lead Forum, hosted by Donna Brazil, highlighting exceptional Black women leaders across America who are fighting for progress in business, politics, media, and the arts. It's one of our most ambitious programs to date, and we hope you'll be part of it. We are proud of the inclusive, mobilizing work we do at All In Together. If you're interested in doing more to advance women's leadership in your community, stay connected to our programs and trainings. Thank you, and we will see you again soon.